You know, it's funny. We put so much trust in the medicines we take, right? We expect them to be safe, we expect them to work. But have you ever really thought about all that goes into actually making sure that's true? Especially when we're talking about brand new drugs still in clinical trials. I mean, the whole system, it's massive. It's intricate. It's a bit mind-boggling when you really dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we're going to try to do today. We're going to demystify some of these regulations, these really important processes that are in place. Specifically, we're taking a deep dive into the FDA's current good clinical practice regulations, cGCP for short, here in the U.S.
And for everyone listening, we really want to give you a solid understanding of all the details, the guidelines that govern these clinical trials. We'll be breaking down how the FDA guidance documents, those key sections of Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, we call it 21 CFR for short, and all those helpful question and answer documents they put out all work together to shape clinical trials as they're happening today. Think of it like this. We're giving you a clear path to being well informed, but without getting lost in the weeds of the technical stuff.
Exactly. And to do that, we've pulled together a bunch of resources. We're going to be looking at official guidance documents from the FDA, examining the relevant sections of 21 CFR, going through some of those really helpful Q&A documents, and even picking out insights from transcripts of actual FDA training sessions.
So much good stuff. All right, let's get into it. To really understand where we are with cGCP today, it helps to take a quick look back. How did drug regulation even evolve in the US? Because believe it or not, there was a time when things were, well, let's just say, quite different from how we handle things now.
You know, what's fascinating to me is how certain public health events, these big moments in history, really pushed the need for these changes, like the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. What was the main goal of that? Do you remember?
Well, from what I recall, that act was all about stopping the interstate sale of any food or drugs that were mislabeled, or if they had harmful ingredients. It was a step in the right direction for sure, acknowledging that we needed some oversight, but it didn't solve everything. There were still some pretty questionable things that could end up in medicines back then.
Exactly. And then, unfortunately, we had that terrible incident in 1937 with the sulfanilamide elixir. They used diethylene glycol as the solvent, and if you don't know, that's basically antifreeze. Just awful. Led to over 100 deaths. And that event, that was a major push behind the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. What would you say was the biggest change that this act brought in?
That act, it brought in mandatory pre-market safety testing for new drugs. So for the first time ever, drug companies actually had to prove their products were safe for people before they could sell them. But even then, they didn't have to prove the drug actually worked. Its efficacy, that wasn't a legal requirement yet.
Right. And then fast forward to the early 60s, we had the thalidomide tragedy. I mean, heartbreaking. Thalidomide, it was a sedative, but it caused terrible birth defects in thousands of babies in Europe.
Hmm.
Thankfully, it wasn't widely approved here in the U.S. Dr. Frances Kelsey at the FDA, she really deserves credit for that, but
Yeah.
still it exposed a big problem.
How did regulations respond to this crisis? That's when we got the 1962 Kefo-Harris Amendments. And let me tell you, those were a game changer. Not only did they keep the safety testing, but now companies had to prove their drug was actually effective for its intended use. They had to show real evidence that their drugs did what they claimed. So we went from just making sure things weren't outright dangerous or mislabeled to proving they were safe, and finally, to proving they were both safe and effective. It's pretty incredible when you lay it out like that. Each step, a direct response to a major public health crisis.
It's like this clear line of progress, right? Back before 1906, clinical trials, they weren't even standard practice. Dangerous ingredients could slip into medicines. But look at us now. We have this comprehensive system. All those advancements in regulation, they were all about protecting public health. And that leads us right to where we are now, with this strong emphasis on good clinical practice. Makes you appreciate how far we've come.
It really does. Okay, so we've seen how drug regulation has changed over time. And it's clear that making sure these new drugs being tested in clinical trials are safe and effective it's vital. But it's not just about the trials themselves, right? It's also about how those drugs, those investigational products, are actually made in the first place. That's where GMP comes in.
And that connection between cGCP, which is all about running the trials properly, and GMP, which stands for Good Manufacturing Practice, that's so important. GMP regulations, like those outlined in 21 CFR Part 211, they guarantee the quality of those investigational products being used in the trials. It's not enough to just do the trial right. The drug itself has to be made to a high standard consistently. Think about it. If the drug's flawed or it varies from batch to batch, how can you trust the results of the trial?
Absolutely. Whether it's a pill, an injection, whatever form it takes, that investigational drug has to be produced at a high level of quality every single time. And I remember our sources mentioned that GMP training often focuses on five main elements. What are those again?
Let's see, those 5 key elements are people, premises, processes, products, and procedures. You need well-trained people working in the right facilities, following clear processes to create consistent products, and all of that according to established procedures. Just imagine, if the people making the drug aren't properly trained, it could directly affect how good that drug is, how consistent it is, and that could totally mess up the trial results.
Makes total sense. It's about making sure quality is built in from the very beginning throughout the entire process of making that drug, not just when it gets to the clinical trial.
Exactly, that's the foundation, and it's absolutely crucial to the reliability of the clinical trial results. If the investigational product itself is all over the place, how can you really know if it's safe and if it actually works?
Okay, so let's talk about actually testing a new drug in people. We know you can't just start giving it to participants without some oversight from the FDA, right? And that's where the investigational new drug application, or IND, comes into play.
You got it. And 21 CFR Part 312, that's part of the regulations all about INDs, it says most studies involving new drugs need to be done under an IND. What would you say is the main purpose of this application?
Well, the IND, it's like the sponsors, usually the drug company, formal way of giving all the necessary information to the FDA. This lets the FDA make sure of a few really important things. First off, the safety and the rights of the people participating in the trial. Second, the quality of the drug itself. And third, that the whole study is designed well enough to actually evaluate if the drug is safe and effective for what it's supposed to be used for.
And the FDA, they have a limited time to review it once they get that initial IND protocol right.
Yeah.
How long do they have, and what can they do during that time?
They have 30 days to review that initial submission. During that time, they're looking at the study design, all the data supporting it, all the details. And if something's not right, like maybe they have concerns about the safety of the protocol or the way the drug is being manufactured, they can issue what's called a clinical hold.
And it's important to note that there are different types of clinical holds. What's the difference between them?
Right. So there's a full clinical hold, which means everything stops. No new participants can be enrolled, and usually anyone already in the study has to stop taking the drug. But then there's also a partial clinical hold. That might happen if the FDA is only concerned about a specific part of the study, maybe a certain dosage level, but not the whole design. So the hold only applies to that part. Let's say they were worried about a really high dose being tested. They might just put a partial hold on that part of the study, but other parts could continue.
Interesting. Now, I know there are some exceptions to needing an IND. Not every study involving a drug needs one. What are some of those cases?
There are a few key ones, like if the drug is already legally sold in the US for specific use, or if the study isn't meant to support a new use for the drug or a big change to its label, and also if the study doesn't significantly increase the risk to the participants. But, and this is important, even if a study doesn't need an IND, it still has to follow all the other regulations. You know, the ones about institutional review boards, IRBs, getting informed consent from participants, and the rules about promoting the drug.
So even if a study doesn't need that formal IND oversight, those basic principles of keeping participants safe, that always comes first.
Absolutely. And when a clinical trial is all set to go, there's one person who has a huge responsibility: the clinical investigator.
And there's that formal agreement between the investigator and the sponsor, all laid out on the FDA Form 1572. Can you tell me more about this form? Why is it so important?
It's really simple. Investigators can't legally participate in a clinical trial unless they've given the sponsor a signed 1572 form. And Section 9 of that form, that's where it gets interesting. It lists 8 commitments the investigator agrees to. It's basically the FDA saying, here's what we expect from anyone running clinical research.
So what are some of the commitments the investigator makes when they sign that form?
Well, the biggest one is that they'll do the entire investigation exactly according to the plan, the protocol, and they won't change anything without the sponsor agreeing and the IRB approving it, unless it's an emergency, to protect the safety of a participant. They also promise to make sure every potential participant understands what they're getting into and gives their informed consent. And that has to be done according to 21 CFR Part 50, which is all about informed consent. Another big one is making sure the study has been reviewed and approved by an institutional review board, the IRB. They're the ones protecting the rights of the people in the research. And of course, they agree to keep accurate records, everything documented properly.
And probably one of the most important parts is the overall responsibility of the clinical investigator. Can you talk more about that?
The investigator, they're ultimately responsible for how the whole trial is conducted at their site. They have to supervise everyone they delegate tasks to, their research team, any outside help they bring in. Even if someone else is doing a specific task, the investigator is still accountable. Did the trial follow the rules? Is the data good? Are the participants safe? It all comes back to them. That's why it's so important for investigators to have the right resources, the right training, and to really focus on the most critical parts of the trial, the areas where things could go wrong.
So even though the investigator can delegate tasks, they can't delegate that final responsibility. They're the ones who have to make sure everything is done ethically and scientifically.
Exactly. And speaking of doing things right, that brings us to a really important principle, something that's fundamental to GMP and good clinical practice. Good documentation practices, GDP.
One of our sources put it perfectly. If it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. Why is documentation so important in this whole world of regulations?
Good documentation practices, they're the key to being able to trace everything back, to know who did what and when. It all comes down to quality and integrity for every single step, whether we're talking about making the drug or running the trial. If something wasn't documented, you just can't prove it happened. Was it done right? Was it done at the right time, by the right person? You just don't know. Accurate records made at the time things happen, that's the proof that procedures were followed, that the data is reliable.
In our sources, they actually had a whole video transcript about applying GDP. They highlighted some really practical guidelines. Let's walk through some of those. What are some of the basic rules for writing in official records, for example?
Okay, so rule number 1, use indelible ink. No pencils, no erasable ink. You don't want anyone changing things later on. Then, most companies will have standard operating procedures, SOPs, that tell you exactly how to write your signature and initials. You got to stick to those rules. And it's usually a good idea to keep a signature logbook, for everyone involved in GMP stuff, employees, part-timers, even consultants. That way, you can always check if a signature is legit.
And what about when you should make entries, and how do you deal with blank spaces on a record?
You should make entries as things happen, real time or as soon as you can afterwards. You can't do something on the manufacturing floor and then go back to your office hours later and fill out the paperwork. And never leave blank spaces. If something doesn't apply, write NA for not applicable or draw a line through it and initial and date it. That way no one can sneak in extra information later that wasn't there originally.
What about using computers or things like sticky notes when we're talking about GMP?
For official GMP records, you generally can't use things like electronic sticky notes. Those temporary annotations, they're not considered a real part of the record. And for paper records, never use actual sticky notes as a permanent thing. When you make copies, they have to be clear, easy to read, no mistakes. And if it's more than one page, use page numbers, like page 1 of 3, to make sure you have all the pages. And this is a big one. Never, ever get rid of original pages from an official GMP document.
I see. And a signature, it can mean different things depending on what you're looking at. What are some of the ways a signature is used in GMP documentation?
A signature can show a few things. It can mean the person who signed actually did the thing being documented, or it can mean they're writing down what someone else saw or told them, like if someone working in a clean room couldn't write it themselves. And it can also mean the person is verifying that something was done right, that the record is accurate. But remember, you can never verify your own work. Someone else who knows what they're doing has to do it, someone who ideally saw you do it right in the first place.
So good documentation practices, they're about creating a clear record, something you can check. Every action, every observation, every decision throughout the entire process of making and testing a drug. That's how you ensure the data is good and lets you go back and see exactly what happened if you need to.
Exactly. And that same attention to detail, that rigor, it goes beyond paperwork. It extends to the actual lab testing of those drugs. That's where laboratory controls come in.
And laboratory controls, they're a crucial part of GMP, especially when we're talking about dietary supplements. I was reading the EAS Consulting Group transcript about 21 CFR Part 111.
Yeah.
That's the one specifically for dietary supplements, and they really highlighted that. So what are some of the main things a quality control lab does in that context?
The QC lab, they have a ton of responsibility. They're doing analytical testing to figure out what's in the raw materials, the finished products, even samples taken during manufacturing. They're checking for purity, potency, all those things. They're also doing microbiological testing, making sure there are no nasty bugs in there, and physical testing, checking the appearance, how it breaks down, all that. Plus, they're often involved in developing and validating the actual testing methods themselves. Got to make sure those are reliable. And sometimes they even manage stability testing, seeing how the product's quality holds up over time in different conditions. And it's interesting, the FDA, they often find problems with how companies set product specifications. That's 21 CFR 111.70. And with the actual testing itself, 21 CFR 111.75. So those are clearly areas they focus on when it comes to dietary supplements.
Now, for a testing method to be considered scientifically sound, to be reliable enough for a QC lab to use, it needs to have some specific qualities. What are those?
A good testing method has to be accurate. The results it gives should be close to the true value of what you're measuring. They often test this by spiking samples with a known amount of the thing they're looking for. And it has to be precise, meaning if you test the same sample a bunch of times, you should get similar results each time. Specificity is important too. The method has to be able to measure what you're interested in without being thrown off by other stuff in the sample. Then there's ruggedness. That means the method still works, even if little things change, like different people doing the test, different equipment, different days. And finally, every method needs a clear purpose. What is it supposed to measure? How will the results be used? You have to define all that.
And there are some established resources that provide these validated test methods that labs can use. What are some of those?
Some of the big ones are the United States Pharmacopoeia, the USP. They have standards for drugs and supplements. Then you've got AOAC International. They develop and validate methods too. The Food Chemicals Codex, FCC, they provide quality standards for food ingredients. For microbiology, the FDA's Bacteriological Analytical Manual, BAM, is really important. And for environmental testing, sometimes they use methods from the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA.
And just like with manufacturing, good documentation is super important in the lab. What are the rules about documenting lab work?
Everything you do in the lab has to be documented, no exceptions. Doesn't matter if it's on paper or in a computer system, and you have to do it as you're doing the work. That's something they really stress in the GMP regulations. The documentation needs to be detailed enough that you could basically recreate the whole experiment just by reading it, but it should also be clear and easy to understand. And all those good documentation practices we talked about earlier, those still apply. Indelible ink, proper signatures, no blank spaces, all that.
I see. And 21 CFR Part 212, that has some extra requirements for the testing methods used in non-clinical lab studies. What are some of those?
Part 212 says that those lab methods have to be suitable for what they're being used for. They have to be sensitive enough to detect what you're looking for, specific enough to target the right thing, and accurate and reproducible, meaning you get consistent results. And all the stuff used for testing, like reagents, standards, solutions, those all have to be controlled and labeled properly. You need to know what it is and when it expires.
And who's usually responsible for creating and improving things like the specifications for raw materials and finished products and the actual procedures for testing them in the QC lab?
Usually the technical folks in the company, often the QC lab itself, they're the ones who come up with those specifications for the materials and the products, and they develop the sampling plans and test procedures. But then the quality control unit has to review and approve all of that to make sure it meets the standards. And if you ever have to deviate from those written procedures, you have to document it, explain why, and get it approved. And of course, all the test results and conclusions have to be documented too. Plus, you have to keep good inventory records and make sure everything adds up, no ingredients going missing. So it's clear that from the time the raw materials arrive at the facility to when that finished drug is ready for clinical trials, there are a ton of controls in place, not just for making and testing the drug, but also for the materials and equipment used along the way.
Absolutely. It's all about controlling the environment in a pharmaceutical facility. You have to prevent contamination, make sure that product is high quality. Our source on good design practices for GMP pharmaceutical facilities, they emphasize how important it is to separate different manufacturing areas.
Yeah.
How do they usually do that?
They control the flow of people, materials, and equipment very carefully. Different areas will have different classifications depending on how clean they need to be, and you can't just go from one to the other freely. They use airlocks, those little rooms with interlocking doors, to create a transition zone between areas with different cleanliness levels. That prevents air and any contaminants in it from flowing directly between areas. And they use these detailed diagrams to show people the right way to move through the facility, how to put on gowns, which hallways to use, how to move materials through special chambers. It's all very controlled.
Makes sense. And beyond the physical layout, what are the rules about keeping equipment clean and preventing contamination?
21 CFR Part 110, That's the one about good manufacturing practices for food, but it also has principles that apply to drugs. It says you have to keep all the equipment and utensils clean and sanitary. They have to be cleaned and sanitized regularly, and that often means taking them apart to make sure you get every surface. And the whole manufacturing, packaging, and storage process has to be done in a way that minimizes contamination, whether it's a bacteria or other stuff getting in. This means monitoring things like temperature and humidity and having strict controls to prevent contaminants from being introduced and spreading.
And what about the raw materials themselves and the finished drug products? What are the requirements there?
Raw materials, whether they're liquid or dry, have to be protected from contamination. And 21 CFR Part 111, that's the one about dietary supplements. But again, it has good general GMP principles. It says you need written procedures for everything: manufacturing, packaging, labeling, the whole process. And before you can use any component, whether it's a container, a closure, anything, you have to test it according to the specifications and either approve it or reject it. That's 21 CFR 211.84. So you're only using stuff that meets the quality standards.
And all of this, all these
Yeah.
processes, it creates a lot of data, a lot of paperwork. How do they manage all those records? What does the FDA expect?
Record keeping is a huge deal in GMP. 21 CFR Part 211, specifically subparts G, J, K, and P, those lay out all the details about production and control records, including packaging and labeling. And here's the kicker: those records have to be reviewed and approved by the quality control unit before you can release a single batch of the drug. They're making sure everything was done right and the final product meets all the standards.
And what happens if something goes wrong with a batch? What if it doesn't meet the specifications?
If something's off, like maybe the yield is wrong or the batch fails a test, you have to investigate right away. And it's not just about that one batch. You have to look at other batches of the same drug, maybe even other products made using the same equipment, just in case. And you have to document the whole investigation. What happened? What did you do? What did you find out? What are you going to do to fix it and prevent it from happening again? That's all documented. And 21 CFR 211.194, that specifically says you need detailed lab records for all the tests and examinations you do.
And you also need a way to go back and check a batch even after it's been sold. What are the rules about keeping reserve samples?
That's right. The regulations say you have to keep reserve samples of every batch and you have to store them properly, even after you've sold the last of that drug with that specific active ingredient. For most drugs, you have to keep those samples for at least a year after the expiration date, or 3 years after it was sold if there's no expiration date. And those samples have to be in the same container the product is sold in, and you need enough to do all the tests on it, except for sterility and pyrogen testing. So we've talked about developing the drug, making it, testing it, and all that documentation. But how does the FDA actually make sure companies are following all these rules? That's where inspections and enforcement actions come in.
And that's where the FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring Program comes into play. They do on-site inspections and data audits of clinical trials. We learned about that in the FDA CITC 2024 Day 3 transcript.
Okay.
What's the main purpose of those inspections?
Those inspections, they're all about seeing what's really happening at those clinical trial sites and within the sponsor companies. The FDA wants to know if the way things are being done could affect the data, the results of the trial, and they also want to make sure the participants are safe and their rights are being protected. And it's interesting, the FDA, they're pretty adaptable. They change their inspection methods to fit different types of clinical trials, even the new and innovative ones.
And who are the people doing these inspections? Do they usually interact directly with the sponsor?
It's usually FDA investigators, and they're often organized by region. But for trials outside the US, sometimes it's just one investigator handling it. Now, as for the sponsor being there during an inspection of a clinical investigator site, the FDA doesn't have a rule about it, one way or the other. But usually the sponsor isn't there.
And if the FDA finds problems during an inspection, they can issue a formal document listing those problems, right? What's that called? And what should a company do if they get one?
That's the FDA Form 483, sometimes just called a 483. They give it to the company at the end of the inspection if the investigator saw anything that might be breaking the rules. The best thing for the company to do is respond in writing and do it promptly. They should address each observation in the 483 and explain how they're going to fix it and make sure it doesn't happen again. That's called corrective and preventative action, or CKA.
And the FDA, they categorize the results of these inspections, right?
Yeah.
What are those categories? What do they mean?
There are 3 main ones. First is NAI, no action indicated. That's the best outcome. It means they didn't find any major problems. Then there's VAI, voluntary action indicated. That means they found some problems, but they're not going to take official action right away as long as the company fixes the problems on their own. And the most serious one is OAI, Official Action Indicated. That means they found some serious GMP violations, and it's very likely the FDA will take further action. Most companies respond to a 483 within 15 business days. But if you get an OAI classification, that's a big red flag. It means the FDA is worried about your compliance, and you can expect more scrutiny and probably more inspections.
And what are some of the things the FDA can do if a company isn't following the rules? What kind of actions can they take?
Oh, they have a whole toolbox of enforcement actions. They can issue warning letters. Those are official warnings detailing the violations and demanding that the company fix them. And those warning letters, they're public. Everyone can see them on the FDA website. For foreign facilities that aren't meeting GMP standards, they can issue import alerts, basically blocking their products from coming into the US. And if it's really serious, they can do things like issue consent decrees. Those are legal agreements with the company. They can go to court and get an injunction to stop the company from doing whatever they're doing wrong. They can seize drug products, and they can issue administrative detention orders, which basically freezes those products in place. And to wrap things up, we wanted to touch on some of the newer, more forward-thinking approaches to quality in the pharmaceutical industry, specifically quality by design and risk management.
Quality by design, or QBD, that's a big one these days. What's the main idea behind it?
It's about changing how we approach making drugs. Instead of just testing the product at the end to see if it's good, QBD is about building quality into the entire process from the start. You really have to understand what you want the final product to be like, and you have to understand all the factors that can affect that. So QBD is about identifying those factors and controlling them so that you consistently produce a high-quality product.
And how does risk management fit into all of this?
Risk management, that's another critical piece of GMP. It's about being proactive, thinking ahead. First, you do a risk assessment. You identify potential problems, you figure out how likely they are to happen and how bad they would be, and you evaluate the overall risk. Then you move to risk control, where you develop strategies to either reduce the risk or accept it. And good risk management also involves communication. Everyone who needs to know about the risks has to be informed, and you have to review the whole process regularly to make sure it's still working. The goal is to use a science-based approach, with patient safety and product quality always being the top priority. The amount of effort you put into managing a risk should depend on how serious that risk is. And companies often use tools like FMEA, failure mode, and effects analysis to help them identify potential problems and take steps to prevent those problems before they affect the product or hurt anyone. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that making sure drugs are safe and effective in the U.S. clinical trial system is a huge, complex undertaking. We've come a long way from the early days when things were much less regulated. Now we have this intricate web of cGCP, GMP, and GDP all working together with everything carefully controlled and monitored. We talked about how important documentation is, the need for good lab controls and testing methods, the careful handling of materials and equipment, the strict rules about record keeping and managing batches, the role of the FDA in inspections and enforcement, and the increasing use of modern approaches like quality by design and risk management.
And for our listeners, understanding these regulations, it really gives you a glimpse behind the curtain. You see all the work that goes into making sure the medicines we take are safe and effective.
It's true. When you see all the details, all the connections, it really makes you appreciate just how complicated it is to bring a new drug to market safely. It makes you think, doesn't it? And maybe now, knowing more about cGCP and GMP, you'll look at clinical trial results and drug information differently. It gives you a whole new perspective.